So last time we talked with you, you spoke of how recent redistricting was entirely controlled by previously elected incumbents and not the populace of the different electoral districts. And I'm wondering, how did that affect the recent 2002 elections?
It had a dramatically negative effect. Usually after redistricting, so for instance after the 1992 redistricting, you'd expect out of 435 U.S. House seats that about 120 to 140 would be up for grabs. This time around, it was about 35 seats that were up for grabs because the incumbents and the party leaders and the consultants this time around, they had much more sophisticated computers and databases. They've got information on all of us. They've sliced and diced the electorate so many different ways that they were able to carve out these districts in such a way to guarantee themselves safe seats. And to give you an example, in California, where I live, I'm from San Francisco, the Democratic Party incumbents paid $20,000 apiece to the political consultant drawing the district lines to draw them a district in which they could not lose. And, you know, they packed a certain number of Democrats into all their districts to make sure to guarantee the election and what was going to happen in that election. And as a result, out of 53 U.S. House seats in California, 52 of them were won by huge landslides, and the other seat was won by still a 15-point margin, hardly competitive at all. And so this happened all across the country, where the political incumbents and the political class were able to redraw these districts, only taking into account their own lifetime careers is basically what they were doing. And it was appalling to see so few seats. And, you know, a lot of people were hoping that the Democratic Party would retake the House. Well, there weren't enough seats up for grabs to even make that a very viable possibility. And in fact, the Democrats, in a sense, shot themselves in the foot in this process, because in places like California, where the Democratic Party entirely controlled redistricting, they had the choice between trying to draw the districts in such a way as to give themselves an opportunity to win a few more seats, or to ensure the reelection of their incumbents. And they chose to ensure the reelection of their incumbents, and they did this in many other places too. So, you know, the reason why there weren't so many seats up for grabs, giving Democratic Party opportunity to retake the House, was in many ways their own fault. And it's really kind of appalling. And what it means is that for voters, well, we didn't have any choice. Most voters, where you live, the district was already a done deal. We predicted the election results months in advance, and now we've already predicted the results for 2004. We've already predicted 359 out of 435 of the U.S. House seats who's going to win, without knowing anything about inequities in campaign finance, without even necessarily knowing who the candidates are. We've just looked at the partisan demographics of the districts and how they were drawn in the redistricting process, and from that we can predict with great confidence who's going to win most of these seats. And not only who's going to win, but even the victory margin, whether they're going to win by a landslide, 60% to 40% or higher, or a comfortable win, 10% or higher. I mean, you know, it's gotten that appallingly predictable.
Now, and you had a really good betting average last time around. What was it, like 98, 99%?
Yeah,
right?
we out of the several hundred seats we predicted, we were off on one. We predicted the right winner, but we predicted this one particular seat was going to be won by a landslide of 20 points or higher. Instead, it was won by, I think, 17 or 18 points. So we were virtually 100% in our predictions, and we've been doing this for the last 4 or 5 election cycles, and our average since the mid-90s is 99.9% accurate. And you know, and if we can predict these sorts of things, we're a small nonprofit organization. We don't have a huge amounts of resources. It means, for one, donors also can figure this out, or at least they can find the information. They can check out our website if they want. And so it means that donors are giving money to candidates they know are going to win. They're not giving it to buy an election. They're giving to try and get access to the candidates they know are going to win, because the district has been drawn to produce that result. And it also means that the party leaders now, the game there is, you're trying to take control of the U.S. House, so you've got a bunch of districts over here where you know you're going to win, so you don't put any resources into those districts. You don't even really mount campaigns there. And then you got a bunch of other districts over here you know you're never going to win, so you don't waste any time or resources there, and oftentimes they don't even run candidates. I mean, for our state legislative races, 40% of them had no candidate from one of the 2 major parties, because it was such a waste of resources to even try and win in those districts, because the districts was so lopsided drawn during the redistricting process. So instead, if you're a party party leader, you take all these millions and millions of dollars that are raised and you focus it like a laser in just a handful of districts that are going to determine the control of the U.S. House or a state legislative body or what have you. And so, for most voters, we've been sliced and diced right out of the political process.
And yet nobody in the mainstream media seems to be picking up on this. And as well as the actual Democratic or Republican parties, they don't seem to talk about how skewed things are and how they really know going in how things are going to turn out. Why don't they discuss this?
Well, the mainstream media has always been somewhat ambivalent about these sorts of things. They're always looking for the news hook, and oftentimes redistricting doesn't seem so sexy or interesting. But in fact, this time around, the redistricting process was so bad. I mean, think about it. The incumbents in California paid $20,000 apiece to guarantee themselves a safe seat. This is just insider trading. This is no different than Enron or any of these other scandals that we've seen. It's just political insider trading. It's protection money. It's like mafioso at this point. And so even the mainstream press now has picked up on it. So you've seen editorials from the L.A. Times, New York Times, Washington Post, even the Wall Street Journal saying this has gone too far. At this point, you've basically done away with elections in this country for most races. And so, we'll see if that translates into any kind of activity to change it, because the ironic thing is unless there's someone out there that's going to do voter initiatives, you're asking the incumbents to change the rules that guarantees themselves lifetime employment in the absence of term limits. And so the idea that the political parties themselves are going to change this process is not very likely, even though you're having even mainstream media now saying this has really gone too far.
Was California an extreme example, or was it pretty much middle of the road for elected officials purchasing
purchasing their seats?
Yeah,
it was more blatant. This kind of thing is what's always gone on behind the scenes, but no one ever really had the temerity to just blurt it out, as this one congresswoman in California did. And and that she was being interviewed by the Orange County Register, as represented by the name of Loretta Sanchez. And the journalist was incredulous, like, wait, you paid $20,000 to get yourself a safe seat? And, Congresswoman Sanchez was like, well, yeah, that's a good deal. I usually spend $3 million on re-election, So to me, it really reflects how our system has become a politician-centered system and not a voter-centered system. And so, California, in terms of the $20,000, we haven't heard any other reports of that happening in other states. That doesn't mean it didn't happen, but other things went on in other states that were nearly as bad, and the outcome in all these states was the same: is to produce what we call incumbent protection plans, safe seats. Voters don't have any choice in elections anymore. You have more impact in our political system now by writing a check and mailing it half a country away to a competitive race than most voters can have right where they live. And it's almost like the politicians are picking the voters before the voters have a chance to pick them. That's what's going on.
Which is similar to advertising.
Yeah, absolutely. Our system, our political system, in many ways, is resembling our commercial, system and our economic system. Talk
a bit about how, and I know there are many ways that it does, but how money figures into all this. Is it as important or more important than issues that come up in each election cycle?
Well, money certainly has a distorting impact on our political system, though it's not often in the ways that some campaign finance reformers say. And I should say that myself, I consider myself a campaign finance reformer. I was one of the organizers of a public financing measure in San Francisco that we passed a couple of years ago. But oftentimes you'll see headlines, "Money buys elections." And in fact, when you have a redistricting process like we have now, where the districts are being drawn to produce a certain result, it means that the money is playing a subsidiary role to the demographics of the district and the whoever draws the district lines. And in fact, as I said, we at the Center for Voting and Democracy, we predict elections months in advance. In the case of 2004, almost 2 years in advance. And we don't know anything about inequities in campaign finance when we make these predictions. And we can predict not only who's going to win, but the margin of victory. Because you can look at the partisan slant of the district and figure it all out. So that means it's not that money isn't having an impact, but it's having a different impact than we sometimes say. It means that, for instance, if you have an open seat in a party primary where you don't, all the candidates are from the same party, there money can have an impact if you have one candidate that has way more money than another candidate. And that, which raises an interesting reform possibility. Rather than trying to pass laws for campaign finance reform and restricting the amount of money, the political parties themselves could set a rule saying our candidates have to all have equal amounts of money. And we could pressure the Democratic Party, for instance, to change its rules so that when all their candidates raise money, it goes into a common fund, and then it's all split equally among the Democratic Party candidates, and then let the best candidate win instead of the best funded candidate win in the Democratic Party primaries. That might be easier than passing a law, because when you pass a law, you run into a lot of First Amendment objections and lawsuits and all these sorts of things. So. And also, I think it's important that we start moving towards a system of public financing of elections. Particularly if we're going to have more third parties and independent candidacies out there, we want to make sure that they have enough money to get their viewpoint and get their policies out there. To me, public financing of elections it's an infrastructure question. We wouldn't ask the political parties, for instance, to count their own ballots. We recognize there's a conflict of interest there. And so we, taxpayers, pay for the counting of the ballots to do it in a fair manner. Similarly, I think we should not leave the getting information to voters, the information they need to vote. We shouldn't leave that in the hands of a privately financed system. That also should be funded by taxpayers to make sure that all voters have the information they need to make a good decision about which representative is going to be best for them. And the privately financed system that we have now just can't do that. Instead, you don't hear from everybody. You hear from the candidates that have the most money. So it really does impact the debate and discussion of ideas, even while it doesn't always impact who eventually is going to win all these different legislative districts, because the districts have been drawn in the redistricting process, gerrymandered, rigged, whatever you want to call it, to produce a certain result. So public financing of elections is very important, and it goes well with other reforms like proportional representation and instant runoff voting.
Now, is your definition of public finance reform, is that the same as the definitions of public finance reform we're hearing from people like, let's say, John McCain?
Yeah, well, I know that John McCain and his other organizations, the one called Clean Money, they support a few different methods, and I think they all have their merits. One is free airtime for candidates. It seems to me that should be a no-brainer. Most established democracies in the world have some sort of free airtime for their candidates, and that's where most candidates, particularly in the higher profile races, spend their money. So if we had free airtime, certain amount of free airtime for all the candidates, it would decrease the amount of money they need to run for office. And actually, one of the chapters in my book is called "The Winner Take All Media," and you can see that the media, they're supposed to offer what's called the LUC rate to candidates. It's the lowest rate that they can offer. And but they do this little kind of shake and jive on the candidates. They say, well, we can offer you this rate, but we can't guarantee when your ads are going to run, And if you're a candidate in a hot race, you've got to know that your ad's going to run after, this particular television show or right after your opponent's ad or what have you. Timing is essential. And so they basically say to candidates, well, we'll run your ads at these low rates, but we can't guarantee when they'll run. And so they basically shake down the candidates and get around. It's a loophole in the federal law that provided lower rates for candidates. And then also, when it comes to issue ads, like Sierra Club and others doing their issue ads, they jack up the rates as you get closer to the election to 2 and 3 times what it normally costs them for their advertising time. So the media is just gouging candidates and gouging organizations. It's a huge cash cow for them at this point. The media also has done this interesting thing, and when I say media, I mean, of course, mainstream media, because I think the alternative media has been much better in giving access to candidates and getting points of view out there. But the mainstream media has also, you can see over the last 15 years, they've decreased the amount of news coverage they give to candidates and to elections. And by doing this, they've forced candidates to buy more time. Now, there's a lot of debate about whether this was a conscious policy or whether just, they were responding to what voters were saying, is that they're not finding elections particularly interesting. Whatever the reason, now at this point in the game, they have reduced media coverage of candidates and elections to about a minute per night. It used to be, 8, 9, 10 minutes per night. It's down to about a minute per night, and it's forcing candidates to buy more time than they ever had to before. So basically, the debate and discussion of ideas and policy questions is being left to candidates and their ads, which are usually pretty negative, attacking the other side, and there's no mediating institution left anymore that is helping voters to sort out candidates. I mean, that's the trajectory of where the winner-take-all system is going.
Do you know, in terms of pre-election debate coverage, has that gone down as well as news coverage on for elections?
Yeah, we've never had a lot of debates in this country compared to other nations, and even compared to what we used to have. I mean, the famous debates in the United States are the Lincoln-Douglas debates in 1860, where they had a series of debates. I think there were 7 debates, and each of them lasted several hours. If by all reports, they were 2 master orators at the peak of their performance, just laying it all out there. And I must say, it's hard to imagine listening to the types of candidates that our political system fields today. George W. Bush or Al Gore debating for 3 hours. I mean, that's a snoozer right there. And unless you're going to add people like a Ralph Nader or a Pat Buchanan to fire things up. So the debates have become the Commission on Presidential Debates, for instance, it's basically a front for the two parties who have erected barriers to keep independent candidates and third-party candidates out, and they've erected criteria where you have to have 15% in the opinion polls by a certain date. And if they had used this criteria, say, going back for the last few decades, the only candidate in the last 4 decades that would have qualified to be in the debates was George Wallace in 1968. So Jesse Ventura, for instance, using this criteria, would not have qualified for being in the debates in Minnesota, and he was included in those debates. John Anderson in 1980 would not have been included in the debates. Ross Perot would not have qualified for being in these debates. So they basically, again, the two parties, they act like whatever can we call it, but the Microsoft of politics. They try to rig the rules to keep the other competition out, and the debates is just another example. Ballot access laws is another example of how they try to do this.
Well, I have to wonder about when people like John McCain, and I'm not sure if it was specifically him that's talking about free airtime. You said that he was. Does he really mean free airtime for everyone that throws in their hat, or did he mean free airtime for the two main parties?
Well, those sorts of details are important, and they're going to have to be worked out. I'm not sure in McCain's example what he means, but I know that, his state of Arizona passed a voter initiative a couple of years ago called Clean Money, which was full public financing of elections for candidates that wanted it. It was a voluntary system. And, of course, the anti-reformers, after it was passed and used a few election cycles, they're trying to get rid of it. And McCain has come out in favor of that clean money public financing system, and the Green Party and the Libertarian Party in Arizona have used public financing rather effectively to run their candidates, get their message out there, create more debate and discussion. They haven't really been able to win any seats because it's still a winner-take-all system, but it has had some impacts. The governor of Arizona is a Democrat, just won in November, a woman, and in a fairly Republican state, and she was a publicly financed candidate who was able to get out there, get her message out there, and win a very close election. So, some of the powers that be, people like John McCain, Russell Feingold, and others, they do support public financing of elections, and I think more and more we're going to see more support for these types of reforms.
Getting back to how the current system focuses on a very narrow margin of the populace on elections and shaping their issues around to attract them. Can you give us some examples of how this has happened in the past? I know, for instance, like the youth vote doesn't seem to ever be of any interest to the two main parties.
Right. Well, to understand what happens to how youth are basically left out, they're part of what I call the demographic dropouts. What's happening there is it's an example of the trajectory of our winner-take-all system. And to give you an example, let's take the November 2000 presidential election. Very close election, right? I mean, it was won by a hair. The winner didn't even have a majority of the popular vote. It was one of the closest presidential elections in history. And yet, all the political insiders knew that about 42 or 43 of the states were done deals. Everybody knew either Bush or Gore was going to win these states. Large states, too, like California, Texas, New York. Everybody knew who was going to win those states. It really boiled down to just a handful of states in the presidential elections. So states like Pennsylvania, Florida, Michigan, and what have you. But then, even within these states, both sides had their polls and their focus groups. And they're basically using these techniques to figure out which groups of voters to talk to and which groups of voters to ignore. And so they could figure out, okay, this group of voters over here, if I'm Al Gore, I know they're going to vote for me because they're never going to vote for George W. Bush. So I can take them for granted. This group of voters over here, I know they're never going to vote for me, so I don't even think about them. So both sides are focusing in on just a handful of voters, or what we call swing voters, the 10 or 15% of voters in the middle who are going to decide who wins in a close election. And now both sides had the polls and focus groups, and what they had figured out, what they believe they had figured out, is that the key swing voters in these handful of states were basically seniors who were above average income. They tended to live in suburbs, and most of them were white. So when you think back to the presidential campaign, what are the issues they predominantly talked about? It was Medicare, prescription drugs, Social Security lockboxes, issues that are of concern to this small group of swing voters. So what should have been a national election to mobilize people to talk about issues and think about our political future, and think about how globalization is affecting us, think about why we have 45 million people without health care, all these sorts of issues that are out there. What should have been a national election to talk about, it boiled down to a provincial election of just a handful of voters in a handful of states deciding which issues are going to get talked about, and indeed deciding who's going to win the presidency. In this process, young people just get completely cut out of the process because, for one, young people, they're not necessarily likely voters. They may or may not vote. Part of that is a self-fulfilling prophecy. The candidates don't talk to them, so they don't vote, and then they don't vote because the candidates don't talk to them, and it just goes round and round. But it's because they're not necessarily considered swing voters. A lot of young people tend to vote Democrat. So the Democrats take them for granted because they know they're going to win most of their votes, and the Republicans don't try for their votes. And part of it is because if you're going to appeal to young people, you might have to talk about issues like reducing the cost of education, or you might have to talk about, producing jobs when they get out of college, jobs programs, or maybe co-op programs where you go to university for 2 years and you work for a year and come back for 2 years, so you have some training besides. And these things cost money. And so but the candidates are trying to focus in on these swing voters that I spoke about earlier, who tend to be fiscal conservatives. So the two groups of voters are at odds to each other. And so for a candidate, and with their political consultants, they're thinking, okay, I'm trying to win a close race here. Which groups of voters am I going to try to attract? Is it going to be this group of seniors who I know are probably going to vote and are fiscal conservative, or this group of younger people who may or may not vote, and I've got to talk about spending some money in order to have programs that they like? In that process, young people just get sliced and diced right out of the process. It's really unfortunate. But then you can look at other nations that use things like proportional representation. In Germany, the German Green Party won 9% of the vote, won 9% of the seats in a proportional system. One of their parliamentarians was 19 years old. They explicitly ran a young person because that young person could talk about young people's issues and attract the youth vote because she is a young person. And so it's really a good example of how the two different systems produce different types of candidates. The proportional systems can produce candidates that appeal to all these diverse constituencies and pull them out to vote, get them involved, and then win their vote. Whereas the winner-take-all system produces candidates that just don't turn on a lot of voters today. They just don't. They're candidates who are using the polls and the focus groups in such a way as to figure out which groups of voters to talk to and which groups of voters to ignore. And so the connection is being lost between many of the candidates and huge swaths of voters out there.
But sticking with the current system, and as screwed up as it is, with fewer and fewer people coming out to vote each election, I don't know what we're down to now, but weren't you telling me before, it's like single digits in most places?
Yeah, in many places we're down to single digits. For our U.S. House elections in 2002, it was 39% of eligible adult voters. And then among 18 to 24-year-olds, we don't have the figures yet for this past election, but it'll probably weigh in about 16 to 20% of eligible 18 to 24-year-olds that turned out to vote.
Okay, so why wouldn't you? Let's say you're with the Democratic Party and they go to your website and they see that they're just going to get trounced this next election. Why wouldn't you, with so few people turning out, actually focus on a group like, let's say, youth or whatever, knowing that if you actually focused on their issues, back those up, and followed through, you could have this enormous voting bloc that would be basically coming out of nowhere and supporting you for years to come.
Right. It's a good question, and the answer has to do with the legacy of Clintonism. And Bill Clinton and the Democratic Leadership Council and what they call triangulation. In the late 80s, there was a struggle within the Democratic Party between the Jesse Jackson Rainbow Coalition wing and the Bill Clinton Democratic Leadership Council wing. The Jesse Jackson wing throughout the 80s, the Jesse Jackson campaigns, which I was a part of in the 80s, they were very exciting campaigns, and one of the goals was to register a lot of voters, young people, minorities, working class people, and get them involved and have them become Democratic Party voters. The Democratic Leadership Council, Bill Clinton wing, they said, we're alienating certain voters, particularly in the South, white and racially conservative voters who used to vote Democrat all the time, the solid South. But throughout the 70s and 80s, Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan had been able to use racially tinged appeals, actually, to peel off huge chunks of the white working class in the South. And so Bill Clinton and the Democratic Leadership Council said, what we have to do is we have to talk more to these voters, to these centrist voters, or what they were calling centrist voters. And so you might remember in the early 90s, Bill Clinton's attempts to distance himself from Jesse Jackson and the whole Sister Souljah debacle that happened, where he was basically doing that as a way to show that the Democratic Party was not beholden to racial minorities and to these sorts of demographics. So the game at that point, from the Democratic Party's point of view, became using the polls and the focus groups in a way to attract the swing voters, the middle voters, move to the center. And so that philosophy within the Democratic Party prevailed throughout the 1990s. One could argue it worked. Bill Clinton won election in 92. He won re-election in 96. But I think that history is showing that it had huge downsides, because what they did at that point is they failed to keep mobilized their base. And anytime you lose your base in politics, you're hurting pretty bad. And so at this point now, there's another debate within the Democratic Party, and we'll see how it works out. But some people are saying, hey, we tried Clintonism, we tried triangulation, look where we are now. The Republican Party now controls the presidency in both houses of the Congress for the first time in decades, and now we've got to go back to mobilizing our base. But there's still the DLC types who are there. Terry McAuliffe, who's the head of the Democratic Party, he's from the DLC, who are saying, like, no, we still have to have a message that resonates in an age of prosperity with the middle voter, the swing voter, the soccer moms in suburbs and these sorts of things, and we have to be careful about our appeals to racial minorities and to young people and these other demographics. So maybe we'll see in the Democratic Party that they're going to start trying to harvest more youth vote, more minority vote, which has always historically been important to them, but it's hard to say at this point which side is going to win out.
So certainly before the elections, they're very concerned with demographics and a concept you called demography. Am I pronouncing that right?
Right. Demography versus democracy. That's where we are today.
And then what's the reality of what happens post-election? How do our elected representatives end up representing us in terms of, on votes? Is there some type of statistics that show how often they vote with the populace they're supposed to be representing?
Yeah, there are. One of the things I go into in my book, Fixing Elections, The Failure of America's Winner-Take-All Politics, is the impact of our winner-take-all system on legislative policy. And there's actually two researchers whose work I cite in my book, Jacobs and Shapiro, and they made an estimate based on looking at what the public says it wants via opinion polls and these sorts of things, and then comparing that to what actually comes out of the Congress in terms of policy. And their estimation is that the Congress is now on the same page as the American people about 40% of the time. It used to be, 10, 15 years ago, well, maybe more like 15 to 20 years ago, about 2/3 of the time, 67% to 70% of the time, the Congress was on the same page as the American people. And now we're down to 40%. And, and then when you look at the nitty-gritty of how policy is formed and how they're manipulating the winner-take-all system, because the winner-take-all system is a geographic-based system. We have all these districts all across the country. And you can see all sorts of votes on policy where, for instance, the minimum wage debate in Congress. The Republican Party knew they had certain incumbents in close races that they needed to allow them to vote yes on minimum wage. So they wanted to bring up a bill on minimum wage, but they didn't want that bill to pass. So but they also knew if too many of their own members voted yes, the Democrats also would vote yes, and the bill would pass. So what they do is they bring up the minimum wage bill. The bill passes, so they allow it to momentarily be passed. And their House members now have had an opportunity to vote yes on it. So then when it comes time for re-election, they can now say to their voters, I voted yes on the minimum wage bill. But then they turn around and they take that bill and attach it to a tax cut bill that they knew Bill Clinton had already said he wasn't going to sign. So they do these sorts of legislative hijinks all the time, looking at the geographic nature of our system and which members of their political party are perhaps in danger of losing, and crafting bills in which they can vote on these bills in such a way as to just basically give them campaign fodder to tell people about what they did and did not do. The Democrats do this sort of thing too, with the tax cut bill. Back in the 90s, they didn't necessarily want a tax cut, but they had a bill that allowed their members to vote for a tax cut, and then go back to their home districts and say, I voted to decrease your taxes. And that's just one example of the types of techniques and the way that the incentives of the winner-take-all system have turned our politics into the permanent campaign. And people if they're bewildered by what happens in Congress, it's not any fault of their own. It's because Congress is a very opaque institution at this point because of all the different tactics that they use in these sorts of ways.
Do you know of any elected officials at the upper levels, Congress and Senate, that actually have put in place mechanisms for finding out from their constituents how to vote? For instance, an example, recently we had a vote on whether the Congress would support President Bush going to war with Iraq. It was a couple months ago. And I remember one of our Congress people, if not both, came forward and said, this is one of the toughest votes I've ever had to make. I really had to do some soul searching. And my response was, should have been a no-brainer. If you just went to your people and asked them what to do, you wouldn't have had to done any soul searching at all. You should have just represented what we wanted. Do you know of any elected officials that actually ask their constituents what to do?
No, I'm not aware of that, and I don't think they would, because again, in this age of poll-driven politics, and particularly in the winner-take-all system, the party leaders are sitting back and looking at all the different congressional districts, and they're saying, okay, this district over here, we know we're going to win that one. We don't have to worry there. And you'll see that the Democratic Party legislators that came from safe seats, they tended to vote against the war. And then you have other Democrats who are from swing districts, close races, and those are the ones that tended to vote for the war because they're afraid of getting caught on the wrong side of that issue, because they figure as Democrats, those who vote Democrat are not going to vote against them on this issue, because otherwise they're going to get a Republican. So they're counting on the fact that because there's such a lack of choice in our two-party system, that voters, even though they don't like what they did on that vote, are still going to vote for them because the alternative is even worse. And in the meantime, by voting for war, they also have the potential to pick up votes from these swing voters who maybe are in favor of the war. So they're always doing these sorts of things, never voting their principles, never voting even what they really think or feel in their own hearts and souls, but they're voting instead on what they think is going to win their own re-election. And that's why we see this often schizophrenic outcome that comes between the politicians and their voters.
All right. A couple more questions before we get to the solutions on how to fix all this, which you luckily have a lot of great suggestions on what we should be doing. I saw a stat for the last election in November 2002 that basically said there was a real high correlation between campaigns that spent the most money tended to win. And it sounds like from what you've told me already that was more the campaign money was going in there to buy favors after these people did win.
Right. It's going to the ones who they know are going to win. So, of course, you're going to see those who are winning spending more money or having more money to spend because the donors are giving. It's like betting on a horse. If you know one horse is going to win, you're going to bet on that horse, not on one you know is going to lose. And so that's really the dynamic that's at work there.
Okay. The second thing that came out after the most recent elections was, I believe it was Ronnie Duggar circulated an article about that specifically most voting machines in a lot of parts of the country are manufactured and controlled by one corporation, and that there's no transparency in seeing how they produce these, how they run them, and that they could easily be rigged, and that this needs to be opened up. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I'm really glad to see the attention that's coming now to this electoral infrastructure process. I mean, if you think about what happened in Florida in November 2000, how the voting equipment just completely melted down there, as well as all the other problems that had there. And you compare that, for instance, to the country of Brazil, just had its presidential election, when Lula was elected from the Workers' Party, and the entire election in Brazil is computerized. Voter walks into the voter's booth, they push a button for their candidate, and a photo of the candidate they just pushed the button for comes up on the screen so they can visually verify who they voted for. So there's no undervotes, no overvotes, no Jews for Buchanan, as we saw in Florida, where people with the butterfly ballot were voting for the wrong candidate. This is not rocket science, and not to knock the country of Brazil, but here we are, supposedly the lone remaining superpower, the wealthiest country the world has ever known, and we are playing catch-up to Brazil in terms of our electoral infrastructure. It's appalling, and it's been this way for decades. Our electoral infrastructure is underfunded. There's not enough attention given to it. It's like, what if we didn't fund our highway infrastructure and bridges and railroads and these sorts of things? We started having all these crashes going on. We would be suitably upset. But with our electoral infrastructure, we have just let it rust and corrode for decades. And so now here we are, 2002, trying to play catch up. So the voting equipment that's out there, I'm pretty aware of this area of things because my organization deals with voting equipment a lot in different jurisdictions. There's quite a few vendors out there, actually. There's not just one that sells all the equipment. There's probably three large ones nationwide. One is called ES&S, that's the largest. Another one's called Sequoia Pacific, and a third is called Diebold. It used to be called Global Election Systems, but they were bought by Diebold. And I think it's a competitive environment out there. So the idea that one of these competitors is going to somehow rig things, it's not that they couldn't, but if they were ever discovered, just like with Enron, we saw what happened to Enron. They tried to do all these shady practices, and now they don't exist anymore. And so I think that there are incentives out there that do keep it from becoming just such a circus as some are worried about. But I think it's good to start asking all these questions. And with computerized voting, there certainly are a lot of questions to ask. There's also a lot of advantages to these touch screens. You can have multilingual ballots for cities, and as I said, you can do things like have a photo of the candidate come up on the screen so you can visually verify who you want. And that's what they have in Brazil. It worked fine in Brazil. If someone was going to try and rig an election, you'd think they'd try to rig one in Brazil where a socialist won the presidency, but it didn't happen. So, I'm not maybe as concerned as others are about this, but I think it is an area where we have to keep asking a lot of questions and keep trying to refine the technology. But we definitely want to get away from punch cards. Some people have said we want to go back to paper ballots, keep it simple. But let me tell you, there was lots of fraud all over the country when we just had paper ballots. Ballot boxes would disappear. There used to be techniques that they would have when they're counting ballots. So they would keep a little pencil between their fingers, and if they would come up with a ballot and no one had marked a particular race or ballot measure, they would just quickly make a slight mark next to that candidate. So, there's all sorts of techniques to rig or to try and commit fraud in any election system, and we have to build in the best securities we can.
All right, well, let's talk about some solutions here. One of them that you propose, I believe, is proportional representation.
Yes, proportional representation and instant runoff voting, I think, are two reforms that we have to really start to become more serious about entertaining in the United States at local and state and federal levels. With proportional representation, to contrast it with our winner-take-all system. With winner-take-all, you're basically electing one district at a time, and if whoever has a majority of the vote in that district, they win all of the representation. If another constituency has 49.9% of the vote in a district, they get nothing. And you contrast that with proportional representation, where if a political party has 20% of the popular vote, they're going to win 20% of the legislative seats instead of nothing, which is what you get with our winner-take-all system. If you have 60% of the popular vote, you're going to win 60% of the seats instead of everything, which is what you get with our winner-take-all system. And when you make this change, it changes all these other parameters of our democracy that have to do with representation. Who gets representation, who doesn't? Participation. Proportional representation systems have far higher voter turnout around the world. Often 75 to 95% of eligible adults turn out to vote in these democracies, whereas here we had 39% turnout for our congressional elections. It affects campaigns and discourse, and what I see in our winner-take-all system, what I call the loss of political ideas, an astonishing loss of political ideas. Because with proportional representation, now you have a multi-party democracy. Different points of view are being brought into the debate and discussions. And in the winner-take-all two-choice system, there's incentive to sling mud. If you and I are running against each other, Mike, I win as easily by driving voters away from you as by attracting them to me. So, because there's only one choice left if I drive them away from you, and that's me. So I sling mud at you. That's how you win. That's the incentives of a winner-take-all system. In a multi-party democracy founded on proportional representation, if I sling mud at you, voters now have another choice. So they may be upset with me for slinging the mud. So the incentives are more to say who you are as a party, put your platform out there, put your team of candidates out there, and try to win as many votes and as many seats as you can. So it changes that also. It changes legislative policy in such a way that, you're running on your party platform. And, for instance, if you look at in the winner-take-all system, there's now a lot of splits between cities and suburbs and rural areas. That's because now in the United States, basically Democrats win all of the representation in the cities. The Republicans win all of it in the rural areas, and then there's kind of a split in the suburbs. And so if you're a Republican legislature, like the United States Congress right now, there's not a lot of incentive to do anything for cities. You don't win votes there. And so that dramatically affects policy on public transportation and education and housing and all these sorts of things, where you're basically going to ignore your large population centers because you don't win votes there. Whereas with a proportional representation system, you don't have this kind of regional polarization and balkanization that goes on, because you're getting, the cities would have representation from a Republican Party if there was a proportional representation system, and the rural areas would have representation for the Democratic voters in those areas. So you get more of a cross-pollination of ideas and not this foxhole mentality, bunker down, sling mud at each other, and just try to wreck each other's policy innovations. So it affects legislative policy. It affects all these different things that I think would for our country would be for the better.
All right, and how would that be implemented in a state, in a city, in a county? I mean, how would we bring that, let's say, to Seattle or King County?
Right. Well, you basically can do it. Seattle could pass a charter amendment to change its city council, for instance, to proportional representation. King County Council, you could do the same thing. At state legislative levels, you could pass a state law that would allow proportional representation in your state legislature. And actually, I think it would make for some interesting politics, because here in King County, for instance, you have 13 county council seats. 7 out of 13 in your last elections, last 2 election cycles, there was no contest. There was no competition there was just one candidate running. So it was an uncontested election. No choice at all for voters. Out of the other 6, 2 of them were won by huge landslide margins of over 40%. 3 more were won by huge landslide margins of about 30%. And one race, the closest race, was about 16% of the vote. So that's what the winner-take-all system has produced here. Virtually no elections. There's no reason for the candidates to get out there and run. They don't have to talk about issues or debate or discuss things because they win hands down. If you use proportional representation for the King County Council, you could have a proportional system where you're electing 7 seats 1 year, 6 2 years later, which is how you do it now. And if you're electing 7 seats at once with a proportional representation system, you're going to need about 12.5% of the vote to win one of those seats. And that means you might get a third party or an independent type candidate who can run and win and push new ideas and try to get some discussion and debate. It means some of those incumbents are not going to win re-election that easily. They're going to have to fight more for their seats and make some kind of appeals to voters. So that would be just one example, just here in King County, of how you could really enhance your democracy, and I would think even the policy that comes out of that King County Council by having a proportional representation system.
Would we have to have laws, rules relating to third parties changed as well to accommodate that? You know, like the current law, I think there is that you don't get recognition until you cross a certain percentage line of votes in a previous election.
That would be a good thing to do, to make it easier for third parties to get on the ballot, which, after all, that's about giving voters choice. I mean, our country is supposed to be about choice, if nothing else. Here you have choice in the marketplace. We've got 15 types of breakfast cereal and, 12 different airlines and, all these television shows to choose from. Yet in the political sphere, we basically have 2 choices. And why? It's because the political parties have rigged the rules to keep competition off the ballot. And so I think that these rules need to be changed. It's in so many ways, we are just backward in this way compared to what other democracies do. Another example, registering to vote in this country. It should be universal voter registration. In most democracies, if you have a pulse and you breathe, you're allowed to vote. The United States is rather alone around the world in erecting the barriers we do to participation, for voters to participate, for parties to participate. And so these sorts of things really need to be looked at to get people back involved again.
Talk about instant runoff voting. What is that?
Instant runoff voting is another nice innovation. And this is what we just passed in San Francisco. I was the campaign manager for an effort there. And last March 2002, we passed a ballot measure for instant runoff voting, and the first election will be used in November 2003 to elect our mayor and district attorney. And it was a great victory. Quite exciting to see a change like this and to see San Francisco willing to try something new. With instant runoff voting, voters get to vote for the candidate they like they do now, but they also have the option now of ranking a second choice. That's their runoff choice, and even a third choice if they want. And by doing this, you end up with winners that have a majority of the vote. It's to elect single winner elections like a mayor or a governor, and you can even do it for a district representative if you want to, but proportional representation is a better way to do for legislatures. But with instant runoff voting, you make sure the winner has a majority of the vote, and you do it in one vote. So you don't have these differences in voter turnout between the 2 elections. Like here in Seattle, you have a primary election and then a general election. And, generally speaking, the turnout in the primary election is 50% lower than it is in the general election. So the field is being narrowed down by just a handful of voters. With instant runoff voting, voters get to rank their candidates. If we had used instant runoff voting, for instance, in the 2000 presidential election, the 100,000 Ralph Nader voters in Florida would have been able to rank a second choice, a runoff choice. And thousands of them, no question, would have put Al Gore. If they had had instant runoff voting, Al Gore would have picked up all these runoff votes from Ralph Nader supporters, and he would have had a majority of the popular vote in Florida, and he would have won that state, and he would have won the presidency. So these voting systems do matter. They really produce different results. And if you have the wrong voting system, you can get all sorts of distortions and defects going on in your political process. So this instant runoff voting is a way to it really liberates voters to vote for how we really feel and believe and not worry about spoilers or lesser of two evils and all these sorts of things. And by doing that, it opens up the political process.
And there's plenty of other places that are using this concept, instant runoff voting?
In the United States, it hasn't been used many places. In recent years, the Republican Party in Utah uses instant runoff voting to nominate its congressional candidates because they were having a problem there where winners would win in their primaries with 25% of the vote. It wasn't necessarily the strongest candidate going forth to the general election. So they decided they wanted the winner to have a majority of the vote, and they wanted to get it over in one election. Instant runoff voting is the perfect solution. And this is actually, I think, something that the political parties should be pursuing, is using instant runoff voting in their primaries, because you see quite a few primaries around the country, Democrat, Republican, even third-party primaries, in which the winner does not win with a majority of the vote from their party. And so instant runoff voting would make sure that their strongest candidate goes forward. Instant runoff voting is also being used in a few other places. Louisiana uses it for their overseas ballots because they have a two-round runoff system there. They don't have time to mail out a second ballot, so they have them rank their second choice at the same time as their first choice. And it's also a ranked ballot system is used in Cambridge, Massachusetts for their city council elections, and then there's a bunch of universities that use instant runoff voting to elect their president. And then in other parts of the world, Ireland uses instant runoff voting to elect its president, and London uses instant runoff voting to elect its mayor. Red Ken Livingston, as they call him, got elected using instant runoff voting, building coalitions, because these ranked ballots where voters get to rank their candidates first choice, second choice, third choice, they're really good for building coalitions, where if you don't expect as a candidate to win a majority of first choices outright, you say to other candidates or other organizations, hey, our organization will rank your candidate second if you rank our candidate second. You can build coalitions around these things. And so other democracies around the world have also been using this system for 80, 90, 100 years, and there's a lot of data. We know exactly how these systems work.
Oh, okay, because that would have been my next question, is instant runoff voting something that came from basically the advent of computers?
No, Australia has been using instant runoff voting for 100 years. They still count the ballots by hand. It takes them a few days to do it. Voters mark them with paper. So it's doable, but we just have such a history of having election results immediately in this country. There's a lot of feeling that voters would not tolerate very well paper ballots and a week-long count. So that's why the move is to other types of voting equipment.
All right, we only have about 5 more minutes. What other solutions do you see that are necessary to fix our current system?
Well, besides proportional representation and instant runoff voting, those are in some ways are the two most important, I believe, because the voting system is kind of like the operating system of your democracy. It's just like the operating system of a computer. It operates invisibly in the background, and you don't really notice it until it breaks down, like it did in Florida in November 2000. So you've got to have a good operating system, and right now the winner-take-all system that we have is an 18th century democracy technology, if you will. That's when we first started using it. And it's kind of like using the first version of DOS instead of using the latest Windows operating system or the latest Mac operating system. So first we've got to upgrade the operating system of our democracy, and that's the voting system. But then public financing elections becomes extremely important. If you're going to have third parties out there now, multi-party democracy, you want to make sure they have enough resources to get their message out so that voters have the information they need to make a good decision. So public finances is important. We should be voting on a weekend or a national holiday. Voting on the first Tuesday in November is ridiculous. It goes back to the 1840s when President Polk instituted this to help farmers to have time to get to vote. And, not a lot of us are farmers anymore. The reasons why we instituted that don't exist, and now it's just a difficult time to vote on the first Tuesday in November in the middle of a busy work day when there's really not a lot to vote for to begin with because of all the reasons we've been talking about. So that's something else we need to do. We need to establish a national electoral commission. The United States, again, is rather alone in not having an electoral commission nationally that establishes standards, minimum standards that all states and counties must adhere to, and as a result, it's kind of the wild, wild west out there in terms of the practices that are followed. So that's another thing that we need to look at, and of course, upgrading our voting equipment is essential. I think even considering whether young people, 16 years old, should be allowed to vote. Some nations are seriously considering these sorts of things. And I don't think we need to be afraid of that. We want to lean towards being an inclusive democracy, and unfortunately in the past we've been more of an exclusive democracy. I think we really need to change that.
How can people find out more about your organization?
My organization, the Center for Voting and Democracy, we are a non-profit, nonpartisan educational research organization, and our national office is located outside of Washington, D.C. We have a website, www.fairvote.org, and the phone number is 301-270-4616. And then also I have a website for my book, Fixing Elections, and there you can read excerpts about the book and reviews by people like Lonnie Guinier and William Greider and Hendrik Hertzberg from The New Yorker and others who all have really taken to the book quite a lot. And the website for the book is www.fixingelections.com.
All right. Well, Stephen Hill, thank you for coming in and spending time with us today.
Thanks, Mike. My pleasure.